everyone, and welcome to the fourth lecture in our series with regard to good and evil, old problems in a new century. Our speaker tonight scarcely needs an introduction, but he's going to get one anyway. As you all know, Harold Shapiro served as Princeton's president from 1988 to 2001. He continues to serve the university as a professor of economics and public affairs. He came to Princeton from the University of Michigan, where he served on the faculty for 24 years as professor of economics and public policy and as president from 1980 to 1988. His undergraduate studies were at McGill University and his graduate work at Princeton. Harold Shapiro's research interests range from econometrics and mathematical economics to higher education, science policy, bioethics, and most recently, the question of rare books in university library collections. I believe that Harold's interest in bioethics was stimulated by his service as chair of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission beginning in 1996. Although it may have started with his membership on the first President Bush's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in the early 90s. Whatever the case, he has been thinking, teaching, writing, and speaking about bioethical issues for some time now. So it was natural for us to turn to him for help with this series. We are honored that he agreed to speak on the ethical dimensions of scientific progress, the cloning and stem cell debates. Please welcome him.
Ruth, thank you very, very much for those kind words. It's a great pleasure for me to be here this evening to talk about this particular topic. I will use some of these fancy PowerPoint slides. They really aren't necessary. But the one benefit of them, you can always glance up there and remind yourself what we're all doing here. Since I decided I'd put the title of this on top of every slide I show, just to remind you where we're coming from. I'm going to try to cover a lot of territory here tonight. I hope I won't go too quickly, and I'll try to keep within the time I'm allotted, so there'll be plenty of times for questions on these kinds of issues, which are certainly very current. Indeed, the New York Times had an editorial on stem cells this morning, as did the the Wall Street Journal. And if you look in this week's Newsweek, the stem cell issue is again in Newsweek this week because of some developments in that area. So I'm going to try, however, not to start by going directly to the issue of reproductive cloning and human embryonic stem cells. That debate is well known. I'll summarize it again in just a few moments. But I want to take a step back, because one of the things I'm most interested in, and I think we all should be most interested in, is why these debates seem to have so much energy these days. What is it that's on people's minds, and why is it that we find ourselves at the beginning of this century so focused on these issues, and why is there so much controversy? And I want to try to review, at least with you, my judgment as to why this is so, why there's so much heat and energy behind these discoveries on the scientific frontier and what they mean. And I hope, to design these PowerPoint slides, I never seem to always push the right button on this computer, but I'll try my best and hope we do all right. So let's begin. Again, I'm talking about the ethical dimensions of scientific progress. That'll take up about the first half, I think, of my remarks, and then I'll move on to discuss cloning and stem cell debates. Now, the first thing that I would like you all to remember is what's up there now. That is, scientific progress always inevitably raises ethical issues. And so if you have rapid scientific progress, as I'm going to talk about in a few moments, you're going to get a rapid accumulation of ethical issues. But why does scientific progress raise ethical issues? There are many, many reasons. I'm going to highlight just a few of them. Because it always raises the question of what are the ethical issues of this ethical uses, of this new knowledge. If you have new knowledge, how are you going to use it? And what is the ethical use of this new knowledge versus what you might consider unethical use of the new knowledge? The most startling example in the lifetimes of most of us sitting here, not everybody, but many of us sitting here, of course, is the development of atomic energy. and whether atomic weapons are ethical or only peaceful uses of atomic energy are ethical. These are issues which arise in a very big way with, of course, atomic physics arises in small ways no matter what the discovery you have. So you always have to decide what ethical uses are. Now, the reason I have underneath that the phrase Sophocles and Prometheus, the Pope and New Age drugs, is to try to emphasize to you how old this problem is. I don't know how many of you have read Sophocles' play Antigone, for example, but in that play, early on, there's a poem called Ode to Man. And the scene that Sophocles is portraying here is a shepherd sitting up on a hill with his flock, looking down at the earth below him, and he sees a farmer plowing. Now, to the shepherd, that's the new technology, farming. And he says how wonderful and how smart everybody is for having invented agriculture and so on. But what are they doing tearing up the goddess Mother Earth? That's how he saw it. And he ends up the poem by saying, I could never share my hearth with this person. Meaning, in this development of this new technology, even Sophocles was worried about what this meant for the meaning of life and the kinds of lives people led together. If you remember the legend of Prometheus, what's Prometheus' problem? Prometheus' problem is that he reached too far. He tried, Prometheus, after all, is a god of technology, but he reached too far and was eventually sentenced to a horrible torture for forever and ever, because he tried to behave too much like God. Now, I don't know how often you've heard, with respect to the cloning and stem cell debates, that we're playing God, that this is going one step too far. This is hubris, and we're kind of usurping God's role in our. And so this is an old problem. The Prometheus legend, which far predates the major Western religions, was already onto that issue with, of course, different type of God and so on. Well, what's the Pope and New Age drugs got to do with it? Well, I discovered a letter the other day. I didn't discover it. I learned about it. I didn't sort of make a big discovery, but I found a letter that the Pope sent to his the nuncio, I guess, in Poland, that is his representative in Poland, and he was really taking after the drug companies. He was really very mad at the drug companies. What was he mad at the drug companies? He said, well, they're manufacturing drugs that give you the illusion of getting better, but don't really cure you. And what he was interested in is really psychotropic drugs, which tend to make people feel better, but it's an illusion they really aren't better people, is what the Pope was saying. Now, it's a very, very difficult challenge to decide whether our use of the new knowledge of biological frontier should be used for drugs like that or not. How the Pope knows which is the real you, the you with the drug or without the drug, is another matter. But that doesn't matter. He has an understanding of it. But in any case, I give you these examples from one end of our Western history to the other, so to speak. This last letter was written only 2 years ago, to say that this issue of how you use knowledge has resonance and has had resonance throughout human history. So that's the first ethical issue that arises. You also have to decide, if you're going to face the issue of deciding what is ethical use of new knowledge, you have to face the issue, who gets to decide this? And that's really an interesting question. Who gets to decide what is ethical use of new biomedical knowledge? Who gets to decide if you use it to clone, use it to create human embryonic cells, or use it for psychotropic drugs? Somebody has to decide. And there are lots of possibilities. Some people say the market should decide. Just let, if somebody wants to buy it, someone wants to produce it, that ends it. Someone thinks the church should decide. Lots of people think that that's the way to go. Other people, the government should decide. I don't want to settle that issue. I just want to point out that that's an open issue. You not only have to decide what the ethical uses are, but you've got to figure out who gets to make this decision. And if it's a big change, this is a big decision. So those are two things. You've got to decide an ethical use. You've got to decide who gets to decide this. And I'll just mention one other, although we can go on for a long list here. And that is, there's always issues of social justice involved. When new innovation gets introduced, there are always winners and losers. And someone has to decide who gets to enjoy the benefits and who gets to pay the costs. This is true whether it's a new kind of innovation, which might put people out of work. Okay, might be great benefits to some people, but other people are out of work. And the question is, they're out of work through no fault of their own, but just because an innovation came along. And the question is, do you force them to pay all the costs of this? or you somehow share the cost socially, more broadly speaking. But all new technologies that get introduced, all new knowledge that gets introduced that has some impact, always raises some issues of social justice. So even if you take some of the more radical genetic technologies that have been introduced these days, and let's say genetic engineering, you would say, well, all right, is it ethical to change someone, or to change, to sort of design an embryo and therefore design your baby? Is that ethical or not? Well, quite aside from whether it's ethical or not, you have to decide who gets access to this, and who gets the privilege of doing this if you consider it a privilege, and who pays the cost of it, and so on. So those are always issues. And the only point again is to say that we're going to be in an age almost certainly of extremely rapid scientific progress. Therefore, you can always expect that there will be new ethical issues on the frontier. Now, rapid scientific progress necessarily involves a whole series of other things. That is, scientific progress, I talked about, whether it's slow or fast, will raise the issues I mentioned before. Rapid scientific progress necessarily, I want to say this is not something we have a choice about, raises another issues. First of all, as I already mentioned, there will be a rapid accumulation of ethical issues. And these are not ethical issues because scientists have lapses or ethical lapses. These are ethical issues that are produced by the very success of the scientific enterprise. I'm actually not that interested in the issues of scientists who have lapses. Of course, there are scientists that have ethical lapses, and so on. That's not the issue I'm interested in here. What I'm interested in is the issues that come up and the ethical issues that arise because the scientific community enterprise has been so successful. I don't know how many of you know, but I did a census of all the horror movies produced in the 20th century. That was all was produced in English in the 20th century. And who do you think the bad person is most of the time? It's the scientist or doctor. 2/3 of the time, it's the scientist. And it's science falling into evil hands. Right? That's the theme. These are all B and C movies and so on, so I don't want to make too much out of it. But it's just to point out that that's an issue that's very much on people's minds. Now, okay, so you have a rapid accumulation of ethical issues. How do we resolve them? Okay. Now comes another very hard moment. And that is there will be continuing controversy among competing moral philosophies. And this is, I think, quite important to understand, that unlike scientific theories, where a good theory knocks out a bad theory, and you're always getting a better and better theory, the old theories are in the dustbins of history and so on. That's not the case with moral philosophy. In moral philosophy, you have competing theories, each one of which is coherent and compelling to some people, but does not displace other coherent and compelling moral philosophies. So whether you're a utilitarian, or you're a Kantian, or you have some other kind of moral philosophy, it can be coherent, perfectly logical, and perfectly compelling to you. And however, it does not knock out other theories. So you always have a kind of platoon of moral philosophies competing for our attention and our commitment. And they have different things to say about what is ethical and what is unethical. So not only are you rapidly accumulating all these ethical problems, you're faced with the issue that no single moral philosophy is compelling to everyone. No single way of thinking through ethical problems is compelling to every thoughtful person. We had that as, when I was chairman of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, we called in, for example, the major religions to talk about their views on cloning. Well, they were all over the map. I mean, they were everything from this is wonderful to this is terrible. And so, but those were only the religious philosophies. There are other philosophies around which also disagree. And so you have this level of uncertainty that's always going to accompany our ethical thinking on moral issues. And when scientific progress is proceeding rapidly, we'll have a lot of those. And so we'll have kind of difficult moral seas to navigate as we go into the future. Now, rapid scientific progress also involves some other things. I won't say a lot about them. That is, it involves a temptation and increased tendency to believe that science can take the measure of all things. There's always a technological solution to a problem, even to a major social problem. And this is, sometimes I would suggest to you, a rather dangerous view to have. That there are things that are beyond science, there are things beyond the possibility of science offering any insights onto. I'll talk about it in a few moments. But nevertheless, with so much progress, we tend to think that there's always a scientific solution to any problems we have before us, and even social and political problems. and that I want to suggest is not always a good thing. The other thing that comes with rapid scientific progress is increased human responsibility. If we can do more and control more, we have more responsibility. Responsibility comes with power. These things come together. So in addition to having all these ethical problems, we're faced with the absolute certainty that we have an enhanced area of human responsibility, therefore an enhanced number of things that we're going to have to deal with. The last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of what rapid scientific progress necessarily involves is something called the fragility of traditional human narratives. This, to me, is really an extremely important issue, a central issue, and I want to explain what I mean by human narratives. What are human narratives? The human narratives I am referring to are the stories, either constructed stories or revealed stories, that societies develop in order to give their life some transcendental meaning, in order to feel that you're part of something that's bigger than just yourself, that in fact your efforts are part of something much larger, something much more worthy than oneself. And as far as I know, every society that's ever been discovered or studied has always got narratives which help them give their efforts, their individual efforts, some transcendental meaning. People say that human curiosity is innate. Human beings are curious animals. Well, the fact is there are many human societies that have been discovered that show virtually no curiosity at all. So while curiosity is very common, it's certainly not innate. But I do think the need to construct these stories, if not innate, is at least universal. That every society has some story or series of stories that sort of connects them to the world beyond, the forces they don't understand, to the things that are beyond their control, that makes life meaningful. So for example, just to take our own current situation, we know from the 20th century development in astrophysics, not only is the Earth not the center of the universe, that Copernicus discovered many hundreds of years ago. So not only is the Earth not the center of the universe, not only are human beings, so to speak, not particularly unique, just part of a vast evolutionary scheme that's going on. And after all, we have the same genetic code as all other living organisms have. But in astrophysics, we learn that we are a tiny speck in our universe, which of course is just one of the many universes around. Okay. And it seems to be going nowhere except obeying the laws of thermodynamics. And eventually we're going to all cool off, and in the next billion years the sun is going to explode, and so on and so forth. You've heard those stories in the newspapers. I don't know about many of you, but I know my wife just refuses to read past the first line when it says the next billion years. She always says she wants to know what's going to happen tomorrow. That's what she's worried about. In any case, the fact is that does seem to be the ultimate spot this universe is heading towards. In that case, how can you possibly talk about the meaningfulness of life? You can easily talk about leading a meaningful life. That's important to talk about, but it's very hard to talk about the meaning of life. So these narratives, whether they be the great narratives that underlie the major religions, or they be other constructive narratives, are extremely important to people. And when these narratives are upset, people experience a sense of loss and a sense of anxiety. And what I want to suggest is that very rapid scientific progress very often undermines the truth claims of these various narratives, whether it be religious narratives or other narratives. And therefore people lose their meaning, somehow have a sense of losing their moorings, not sure how to connect themselves to a sort of more transcendental sense of their life, to give their daily efforts some bigger meaning. Now these narratives, which various societies develop, usually in isolation from each other, have interesting structures. They have a lot, you could characterize them in many ways. Sometimes, one way to characterize them is they usually say there's something unique about the Earth amongst all the stars and planets, and there's something unique about human beings. A lot of the narratives have that structure. That's getting harder and harder to sustain. You can still sustain it after all. We're not like anything else, and the Earth doesn't appear from what we know to be exactly like any other place. But uniqueness doesn't have the ring it used to have. As we think about the developments of Darwin or Watson and Crick on DNA and the vast universe we're part of, it doesn't have the same ring. But there's another structure which you can discover in many of these traditional narratives. It's what I call the sandwich narrative, which is what's up there. What is the sandwich narrative? Well, a lot of these narratives have the following structure. There's human society somewhere in the middle here, and there's an upper level and a lower level. The lower level is what we generally refer to as nature, but things that we can control and understand, at least if we don't understand now, we can understand it eventually. These are things that sort of we're the master of, or at least we could become the master of eventually over time. So we're sitting here, and below us are all these things, often called nature, things which we, in principle, we believe we can either control now or will control sometime in the future. But there's always something above, which we don't understand and can't control, and is beyond, beyond human understanding. Obviously, the great religious narratives have this kind of, what I call, not very, maybe a little too flippantly, the sandwich narrative. But many, many narratives have that characteristic. Now, what's happening? Well, what's happening is a lot of the stuff that used to be up here is all of a sudden appearing down below. Right? Things that we thought were beyond our control, like designer children, for example, that are talked about. Things we thought were beyond our control now are coming under our control. As a matter of fact, there are very few things in the world, if you take surveys, that people believe we won't discover sooner or later what it's all about and be able to control it to our own uses. So the part of the world that represented these narratives that was beyond our control, something beyond human understanding, is becoming smaller. Don't mean it's less important, it's just becoming smaller. Things are filtering down from the things that we couldn't understand to things we can understand and control. And therefore this narrative, just like the uniqueness narrative, doesn't have the same pull on people's heartstrings or on people's psychological well-being. And therefore all this scientific progress undermines or can undermine these traditional narratives. And that has two different impacts on people, as it says up on the screen here. Some people think think of the future really as frightening for this reason. It's just very frightening because they don't understand what narrative can replace the one that currently gives their life some sense. There are other people, however, who think of this as reassuring. Why? Because that's a traditional liberal viewpoint, that tomorrow will always be better than today, and they have enormous confidence in human capabilities, and somehow the human race will always mobilize itself to make this a better world and not a worse world. And if you think of a lot of the controversies in bioethics, it really comes along this fault line. People who are frightened about what they see, and people who are reassured by what they see. And we'll come back to that later on. Well, all right, that's by way of background to try to at least to convince you that we can all expect that we and our children are going to have turbulent moral seas to deal with, solely, not only because, but at least because of what's going on in the scientific frontier. And the faster we make progress there, the more these issues will accumulate, the more it'll generate a certain kind of loss of faith and commitment to traditional narratives, and we will have to either construct new narratives and or try our best to deal with the anxiety and loss that this increasing fragility of our human narrative that's produced because of work in the scientific frontier. Okay, now let's go to some examples. Okay, the examples that I would like to use, of course, are first of all the Dolly experiment, human reproductive cloning. I never expected if I had anticipated 1995, would I ever be even thinking about cloning? I don't know. Probably someone would have had to explain just what this was. I certainly didn't know about it. And when I was appointed in 1995 to head the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, I had one request of President Clinton. I said, look, I don't want a controversial issue in the first year. And I was thinking not at all about cloning, which I didn't have really much sense of what was going on in that area. I was thinking about the many previous bioethics commissions which had been abandoned by the federal government because they could not resolve issues surrounding pro-life, pro-choice issues. And if President Clinton wanted us to deal with those issues, I didn't want to deal with it in the first year. I wanted at least the committee to get used to working with each other. But what happened was, very shortly after the committee got together, which was roughly a year later, the Dolly experiment was announced, and he said we had 90 days to deal with that issue. I'll come back to that in a moment. But that'll be one of the examples. The other example I want to use is embryonic stem cells. That should really be human embryonic stem cells. I mean, work on stem cells has been going on for a very long time, but not with human stem cells, because human stem cells are very hard to isolate in a laboratory environment, and so we haven't been able to work with human stem cells until recently. But we've worked with embryonic stem cells of mice for a long period of time. Well, not long, but at least a couple of decades. And lastly, I'm going to want to say a few words about the role of public policy in dealing with these controversial issues. In that sense, I might be revisiting just for a few short moments some things which you must surely have discussed with Professor Gregory somewhat earlier in this series. So I'll try very hard not to repeat what he has said. So let's begin by looking at the Dolly experiment. Now, I won't describe what the Dolly experiment is. I think you all know what it is. It demonstrated that in the case of Dolly the sheep, that you could produce an exact genetic copy. This is not an exact copy, it's just a sheep which has the same DNA. And that's the first thing you have to learn. DNA does not determine everything about a person or an animal. There are epigenetic factors which come in, and so Dolly had the same exact DNA as the mother who provided the DNA, but that does not mean that she was the same. It may look similar, it may have been somewhat like identical twins and so on, but it's certainly not the same. But in any case, the key issue, and the reason why the president told us we had 90 days to report and to recommend to him what public policy should be with respect to human reproductive cloning, and of course 90 days in the federal government means you have about 45 days, because it takes about 45 days of bureaucracy to get from your desk to the president's desk. So you really have a very short period of time. But why was he in a hurry? There was a general and misguided hysteria that followed the Dolly experiment. People, scientists included, not only lay people like myself, but scientists just got really quite hysterical about it. People started imagining things which really were totally sort of impossible and improbable, and all kinds of legislation was introduced into Congress. And so I think the president said, well, he has this National Bioethics Advisory Committee sitting there, why don't they worry about it? Now, you know, when you're chairman of something like the National Federal Advisory Commission like that, you always think that people ask you something because they want your advice. You know, that they think that maybe you know something that you could help and so on. And I'm sure that's the case sometimes. But there are all kinds of other reasons they might ask you. They might ask you because they want to appear to be acting without acting. Okay, so they don't have to actually appear like that. It could be they could ask you because there's a lot of people threatening various kinds of legislation. They just want to postpone action. So they're really not interested in your advice, but they want some kind of delaying tactics no one else acts, etc., etc. There's all kinds of reasons why you may be asked. I'm not sure what President Clinton had in mind when he asked us about God, but it wasn't that general kind of hysteria where people's views of cloning are really determined by science fiction, by movies and other things like that. And we had all these armies of Hitlers and Albert Einsteins and Michael Jordans that people had in their imagination and an awful lot of misguided conversation. The interesting thing about this case is that the short-run solution, that is what to tell the president, was very easy. We decided within 2 hours, okay, what it is we were going to recommend. Now, we had then a long set of hearings because we just wanted to get the subject aired out. We wanted to hear what people had to say. But we really decided within, I don't know if it was 2 hours or 1 hour or 3 hours, but within the first meeting we had on this issue, we knew what we were going to do in the short run. Why was it so easy to decide? You didn't have to be very smart. You just had to take a look at the Dolly experiment and realize that from the point of view of human reproductive cloning, that if you were going to use a Dolly technique to produce infants, that this was demonstrably unsafe and unethical on those grounds alone. You didn't need any other grounds. There may be very complicated ethical arguments you'd have to raise if it were a safe procedure. But it was demonstrably unsafe to the mother. It was demonstrably unsafe to the embryo and the fetus. And as you know, there was something like 300 failures before Dolly was born, and an awful lot of sheep born with chromosomal difficulties and so on and so forth. So the short-run solution was really very easy. But the actual process was very interesting because we had all kinds of theologians testify before us, moral philosophers and so on. They had a lot of very inspiring things to say. Interestingly enough, it was a case where some religious traditions had really some quite interesting things to say, although they, of course, had not thought about cloning itself. But they had thought about unusual births. And a number of the major religions had organized some intellectual apparatus to think through what do you do with unusual births. Now, they weren't thinking of cloning. They were thinking of things that are very peculiar to our ear, right? They were thinking of things like what happens if an angel marries a mortal, or an angel marries a devil, or some other kind of very unusual birth. That, as I say, to our ears, this sounds like a really kind of a humorous thing, but nevertheless, the intellectual tools that they used to try to struggle with that issue stood them in good stead to deal with this unusual birth. And so, in fact, you learned a lot and found really quite inspiring some of the things they had to say, even though they were reflecting a tradition or a set of issues which were no longer really the key issues for us. So the short-run solution was really very easy. The long-run solution, now I'm giving you my own opinion because the Commission wasn't dealing with the long-run solution then. The long-run solution, in my view, is not so important. Why is it not so important? Because my own view is, even if this were a safe procedure, okay, which is certainly far from certain, indeed, the research that's been done since then indicates it really might be quite unsafe. But in any case, let's say it was safe procedure, I'd ask myself, who is going to choose to have an infant using this technique, as opposed to other techniques that are available? And it seems to me you have to have a very peculiar set of views and a very peculiar personality in order to want to use this particular form of reproduction. Now, doesn't mean to say, when I became president of the University of Michigan, I asked my predecessor if he had any advice. He said he had no advice, but he had an observation. What was his observation? He said, you'll find out that there are more peculiar people in this world than you ever imagined. So I suppose, using that, maybe there are people in the world who would choose this. But I don't think it could ever become a widespread social practice. It's almost the most, even when safe, it's almost the most difficult, most unpleasant way to have engage in human reproduction you can really imagine. And so, while there are certain peculiar cases when it might even be desirable, if there were 10,000 babies a year born through using this technique, it would have absolutely no impact on anything. I mean, there are millions and millions of babies born every year. And so, I didn't think it was very important. In any case, our recommendations were that there be a moratorium on the use of cloning for purposes of human reproduction. And I remember very distinctly it's hard to bring ourselves back to that, but this was an important enough event in our recommendation in those days to have these recommendations trotted out with the president and his staff and so on in the Rose Garden in the White House. And what I so distinctly remember about the conversations that took place, the questions and answers afterwards, is if you said to someone, do you favor cloning, human cloning? Oh, people said yes, people said no, and so on. But if you ask the question a different way and say, do you favor human cloning for the purpose of creating infants? And you use the word infant, which enabled them to think about this in a kind of more personal way, almost everyone said no. It was very interesting at that time. And of course, at that time, people hadn't really thought through all this. But our recommendations were simply for a temporary moratorium. As I said before, it was a very simple solution. And it gave, however, one very great benefit to the Commission. Namely, we did get in touch through this process with the religious traditions in our country, so we could go back to them and talk to them about human embryonic stem cells, which I'll talk about in a moment, and many other traditions, other moral traditions, which served the committee very well in the 6 or 8 other reports that we produced during the time of our service. But let's go on now to human. This is what we've got here. Long-run is not so important. I've already told you that we've been through this, so we'll go on to embryonic stem cells. This was in the news even today, as I said before. This should be human embryonic stem cells. I'm sorry for just putting it in the form up there. What is the issue? Now, what is the underlying? Why is this controversial? It's very, very simple. In order to get human embryonic stem cells, for the most part, you have to destroy embryos. That's the controversial issue. It's whether or not one is ever entitled, for whatever your purpose is, to destroy an embryo. Even a very early embryo, an embryo that might come from an egg that had been fertilized 2 days, 3, 4 days, a week before. The question is there any circumstances? That depends on what you believe about the moral status of the embryo, even the very early embryo. Now, if you believe that the fertilized egg has the moral status of a person the moment it's fertilized, then clearly the embryo has that moral status. And you clearly don't go around sacrificing people, even if it's for scientific progress. Especially people who, in some sense, are incapable of giving you consent. So if you think that the embryo has the moral status of a person, this is almost an unthinkable thing. Scientific progress is an option. It's not a moral imperative. And therefore, if you believe the moral status of the embryo, as I've already said, is that of a born person, then that ends this discussion. This is not research that you should engage in, whatever the benefits are, and however many people you might cure in the next generation is just not a relevant consideration. On the other hand, if you believe that the embryo has some moral status, even some significant moral status, but not the moral status of a born person, then you can at least discuss the issue of whether or not you think it's appropriate to produce human embryonic stem cells and, of course, then use them in research. Now, what's special about these cells, I think, as you all know from the public debate here, is that these are so-called pluripotent cells. That is, they can become any cell in the body. And therefore, presumably, you could train them in some ultimate sense to, so to speak, grow up, not as a person, but train some of these cells to grow up as heart tissue or lung tissue or bone material if you need to repair the human body in some way. And they might be extremely valuable in that respect. And so the issue was, you have the moral status issue over here, and then another ethical imperative, namely the ethical imperative to do something to relieve disease and suffering of future generations over here. I mean, that is another ethical imperative. We ought to be doing something to try to relieve the burden of disease for either current and future generations. But we have to do something about the moral status of the embryo. And so the issue surrounds that issue. What is the moral status of the embryo? Now, there are other ways to create embryonic stem cells. You can create them from aborted fetal tissue. That's another, in fact, almost at the same time that John Thomson isolated the human embryonic stem cells from excess embryos left over from fertility treatments. John Gerhardt at Johns Hopkins isolated them from aborted fetal material. Now, so you can, if you get aborted fetal material at the right time and in the right condition and so on, you can get stem cells from that area as well. They're not quite the same, with quite the same characteristics. So, but the primary source is really from the embryo itself, likely to be the primary source. Now, what did NBAC recommend in this case? Here, we didn't have 90 days. We were given 6 months. We actually took 8 months. And so we didn't take the deadline quite so seriously. What NBAC did is say, look, we have a morally contested issue here. We can't convince those people who believe the moral status of the embryo is that of a born person. We're not going to convince them that this is ever a good idea. So what do we do? Well, we took the following tack. We said, look, there are 3 ways you can get an embryo to use for deriving stem cells. 1, you could use cloning. You could use a dolly technique to create an embryo and then destroy the embryo to get the stem cells. You could do that. So you could do it through cloning. You could do it through what I would call a recruited embryo. That is, you get an embryo, you get someone to donate sperm, someone to donate an ova, and you get those 2 things together in a laboratory, you fertilize the egg and create the embryo. You could use that. It's what I call a recruited embryo. And then, of course, are the embryos that you hear a lot about that are left over from reproductive projects. That is, they're excess embryos left over from fertility treatments from couples who have come together to try to have a baby using these kind of fertility treatments, and they've got excess embryos left over. and they're either in storage or they're about to be destroyed, one or the other. NBAC's recommendation was, we did not accept the view that the moral status of the embryo was inviolate. We did not have that perspective. But we did say we understood that other people had quite different feelings than we did, and we in fact respected those feelings. Even though we disagreed, we very much respected them. So we tried to send a signal. So what policy could we kind of imagine? That, of course, the people on the other side of this will recognize immediately we disagree with them. But how can we pick a policy that they might think that at least we heard them, at least we respected them, even if we didn't disagree with them? This is very important in a pluralistic democracy, in my view. And so what we did, we say, okay, look, we should be able to use federal funds in order to either derive new stem cell lines and then use them in research, but only if they came from excess embryos left over from fertility treatments. Only those embryos. Why did we say only those embryos? We said only those embryos because those were embryos that were not created for research. They were created as part of a reproductive project, and they now no longer needed. And so they weren't created simply to be destroyed. They were created as part of an effort by a couple or a series of couples to have children and have a family. And therefore, since they weren't created just to be destroyed, we thought, well, all right, we could restrict the use of embryos to that source. And we wouldn't ask anybody just to create embryos in order that they be destroyed, in order that they be used for research. That was our recommendation. Well, what did Clinton do? He certainly didn't agree with us. And neither, in the fullness of time, did President Bush. The Clinton solution, I actually have less respect for than the Bush solution, although I disagree with both. The Clinton solution was what I call a don't ask, don't tell, which is well known from some other showing you people think alike on different problems. The Clinton solution was, it was all right to use federal funds for this kind of research, providing you only use stem cells that others had created. So you couldn't do the actual destruction of the embryo, but you could use the product of an embryo someone else had created somehow. It was like, don't ask where this comes from, right? Don't tell anybody. It was like as if hiring a hitman relieved you of crime of homicide. So I understand the politics of it, but I didn't understand the ethics of this. And so, but nevertheless, that's what President Clinton's policy was. He said, look, someone out there in the private sector creates these things, whatever their reason is, we don't have to know about them. You can use them, but you can't create them if you're a scientist working on federal funds. That was not ethically coherent in my view, although, you know, it was a policy that was workable, certainly. The Bush solution said he didn't want the federal government any longer involved in the destruction of embryos. You could not only use those stem cell lines that were created before August, whatever it was, 1999 or something like that, or 2000, whatever the year was. So, and he claimed there were 60 lines that were useful, 60 stem cell lines that were useful. That's a very, very restrictive solution. It's an unworkable solution in my view, and we're beginning to see that now. I'll come back and talk about that in just a few moments. So NBAC's recommendations were rejected by the president. He said, if you take care of where the source is, you ought to be able to derive them and use them. There's just too much to benefit here in order to give that up. He said, no, you didn't want that. You could do investigation on stem cell lines only if someone else creates them. Bush, of course, eliminated the latter by saying only those stem cell lines created before some magic date, August 9th of one of the years, I forget which year. So, and that's where we are today. But there have been some developments in both cloning and in stem cell research. Have been in newspapers the last couple of days, and I'm going to finish the Bush solution we talked about. Here we have developments in South Korea, right? They use the Dolly techniques to derive stem cells. You remember a few moments ago I said one of the ways to get a new embryo is to use cloning, to create the embryo, and then you could implant the embryo in a woman, and that's how the Dolly technique works. But this group in South Korea had no idea about it, didn't want to do it for reproduction. They just created the embryo using the Dolly technique and managed to derive stem cells from that embryo. No mean trick. This is not an easy thing. They did it, and that just means the issue will be around with us for a while. Again, I think most everybody I speak to has no interest in using this as a reproductive project, but only to use for medical research in one way or another. In any case, that's the most recent development there. And of course, the most recent development in the embryo research area is that privately financed developments in the U.S. have been proceeding apace. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute has financed a number of stem cell projects. Harvard has just raised X million dollars to do stem cell research from the private sector. Governor McGreevey, that's not private sector, but it's not federal funds. It's committed, I think, $50 million of research funds here in New Jersey to do stem cell research. And so work is going along, but in the non-federal sector. That has a lot of costs to it, because most of the biomedical scientists in this country work in the federal sector, either at universities or actually at federal laboratories. And so we're going to have a much smaller set of national efforts in this area than we otherwise would have, and what the implication of that we'll be able to see as we go into the future. Now, there's one very peculiar thing here, it seems to me, and I don't know how you feel. You notice it says here the derivation of new cell lines is going on in the private sector right now. Now, think about the following. I understand why public policy may have different ethical standards than the policy of a private individual or a private group, because public policy implicates all taxpayers, and you may have to pay some attention to things which a private group could afford to ignore, because we're all involved in any decision the federal government might make. So you might say, well, all right, the federal policy has to be stronger. So even if so it's a distinction in this country where everything is legal in the private sector, right? You can clone, you can do anything. Nothing is illegal in the private sector in this respect. You can create stem cell lines, you can, destroy embryos. Embryos are destroyed by huge numbers every day in fertility clinics. Anything that's in the private sector is perfectly okay. It's only the use of federal funds that's being restricted. Now, why is that? Well, the practical reason is that it's impossible to pass legislation in this area, and only legislation can cover both the private and the public sector. The government, the president cannot declare there'll be no more stem cell research in this country. Only Congress can declare that. And legislation on any side of this issue is impossible to pass in the Congress. Why is that? Why do you imagine that? Because it goes to the pro-life, pro-choice debate, the single most polarizing debate we have in this country. And it can't get anywhere. It just can't get. So there's been no legislation at all in this area in Congress. So we have this big divide. It's okay, anything goes in the private sector, absolutely anything. And we have no idea what's going on there. Whereas in the public sector, virtually nothing is going on, or very little is going on. Now, you could say, well, so what? In some sense, so we'll do a little less. It's not the worst thing in the world. But one of the things that puzzles me is the reason to be against this is you think that destroying an embryo is somehow roughly equivalent to homicide, right? Because you're destroying something with the moral status of a person. Now, if the crime is homicide, if that's true, then the state has an enormous and compelling interest to govern both the private and the public sector. It's a very unusual divide to have on this particular issue. And we're the only country that has this divide. And we're the only country that cannot resolve this problem. The pro-life, pro-choice is a huge moral divide, but it's controversial everywhere because this is a very difficult problem, very difficult issue. But other countries find some way to deal with it, either by banning it in public and private, or by authorizing it in the public and private sector. They deal with it in some way, which I think is much more ethically coherent than we're able to do in this country, because of this enormous difficulty we have in dealing with the pro-life, pro-choice issue, regardless of which side you're on in this country. So I presume it's going to continue in that way. Now, the last thing I want to say is that while the ethical issues that come up in relation to scientific progress have been with us throughout Western history, there are two things that are very new. One of them, has to do with making public policy in a liberal democracy. Now, I presume that Professor Gregory talked about this, so I'm not going to really talk about it. My time is almost up in any case. But this is a relatively new thing. Liberal democracies are not that old, and it's not clear they're going to succeed forever and ever. and it's very difficult to make public policy in a liberal democracy, especially when you're trying to manage morally controversial issues. It's a very difficult issue in which we don't have a lot of experience. We might have 150 years experience that's really real experience in this respect. And so I don't know where that's going to go. But we do have two liberal democracies, the US and the UK. I don't know which one's more liberal than the other. It probably doesn't matter. They're both in the same category. And the UK has had a lot easier time dealing with it than the US. It's been equally controversial. There are enormous feelings on both sides of the issue, both in the US and UK. But somehow, they've been able to deal with it. It may have to do with their form of government. It's a parliamentary form of government rather than the kind of government we have here. It may have to do with other issues. That's for another talk. But I only raise these issues because I don't think it's intrinsic in a liberal democracy that you cannot resolve these issues. I think it is intrinsic that these issues are very difficult. Because after all, in a liberal democracy, we honor diversity of views. Moral pluralism, political pluralism, pluralism of all kinds is what defines who we are. It's what we honor amongst ourselves. And that's what liberal democracies stand for, or at least one of the things that they stand for. But as science is going to generate more and more of these controversial issues as we go ahead, we're going to have to find some way within the liberal democracy that exists here in the US, okay, as opposed to the ones that exist elsewhere, to deal with these issues in as effective a way as possible and a way that will serve the interests of future generations. So this is, I'll just perhaps make one remark and then open it up for questions. It was an extraordinary experience working as chairman of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission. It's not very often in life you get the idea to redo your whole intellectual set of interests in my advanced age. And so that was very exciting, and I have a lot to thank for the intellectual generosity of the other members of the commission, who were absolutely outraged when I was appointed. Who had spent their lives in bioethics, and they couldn't imagine what the president had in mind. As a matter of fact, not only they couldn't imagine, I couldn't imagine. Because when President Clinton first called me and said, "Would you do this?" my first reaction, silent reaction, was he'd made a mistake. And I thought, and the image I had in my mind was the staff had given him a list of names, a list of phone numbers, and a list of tasks, right? And he had to phone these people and ask them to do these various tasks. And in going down the list, he or a member of his staff had just sort of lied and gotten out of focus. I'd gotten out of focus. And he wanted to ask me to do something else, but he ended up asking me to do this. So I didn't have the nerve to say that. Two, I didn't exactly get calls from the president every day. But I did know his science advisor very well. So I called his science advisor and I said, "Look, I think this is a mistake, but don't worry about it. Nobody has to be embarrassed. I'm not going to tell anybody. You want to give me something else to do, give me something else to do, and make the phone call you intended to make." He said, "Well, I'll get back to you." And it got back to me a few hours later. It says, "No, it's not a mistake. They want you to do that." And I think, as I've been able to think about it in retrospect now, I don't know what they had in mind, and I never really did pursue it any farther. But one of the advantages that turned out was I had one quality which turned out to be an advantage. And that is, I didn't talk publicly about things I hadn't thought about. So as a result, I didn't have any publicly announced position on any of the controversial issues simply because I'd never thought about them. I never thought seriously about them. So I had this advantage, and the president couldn't have known what I thought in the pro-life, pro-choice. I certainly didn't ask me, I never told him. And he wouldn't have a way of knowing from anything I ever said or did in public. So that he may have made inferences in other ways, but he really couldn't have known. In any case, whatever the reasons were and however it happened, it was one of the more enjoyable intellectual experiences I had, and it's been a very great pleasure to speak to you tonight. Thank you all very much for listening. Yes.
My educational side is the University of Michigan. So
right? Go blue, as they say.
Yeah. But earlier, one of the earlier subjects you covered was who makes the decision.
Yes.
And I'm thinking in a world that's grown smaller and where this research can be done anywhere, as a practical
So the
matter,
progress is going to be slower, even if other people eventually do it. And if it's important, and if you think there really are some enormous clinical payoffs here eventually, we're slowing the day of the arrival of those dividends. And, and the question is it worth it? Should we slow this down? How much are we going to slow it? Very difficult to say. But, the U.S. probably does as much biomedical research as the rest of the world put together. And so if you take, not all of it, but if you take a third of all that effort, and you say, well, you can't devote it to this effort, it's bound to slow it somewhat, but again, that's just imagining. I'm not quite sure. Yes?
I think it's the prevailing view of the public and probably our government officials as well that scientific community cannot regulate itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the most striking examples that it can occurred more than 30 years ago
Right.
when DNA was able to be moved from one organism to another in the Sillamar Conference.
Right.
Revealed that scientific principles could be applied in ethical ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yet you are a member of an advisory committee, and the term is appropriate advisory
Right.
because the government rejected
Correct.
the recommendations.
Correct.
So the balance has to be struck
Mm-hmm.
between government regulation, and I work in a regulated industry,
Mhm.
pharmaceutical industry, and I support government regulation. I do not advocate purely leaving the ethical decisions to the scientific community. Where's the balance?
Well, I don't have an easy answer to that question. I think it is true that scientists, most scientists, overwhelming number of scientists, have the same type of ethical concerns as everybody else does and try to manage their life in the best way they can. I think, however, that it would be a mistake to leave, and you haven't suggested this, I'm just saying it would be a mistake to leave the regulation of science to scientists alone. They have an inherent conflict of interest. And what we've learned from a long observation of human efforts is when people have inherent conflicts of interest, the saints need to be protected. I'm not talking about those who want to sin. I'm talking about these conflicts of interest overwhelm good intentions. And if you look, especially at the area which you may or may not be familiar with, I'm not sure which area, what part of the pharmaceutical industry you're in, but if you look at human subject research, the biggest ethical lapses in human subject research came from scientific projects which were extraordinarily well motivated by scientists who had nothing, only wanted to help. That's all they wanted to do is save mankind. They thought they were in the process of doing so. But in the process of doing that, and the enthusiasm for doing it, and the dedication to it, it's easy to find yourself making ethical lapses. So you need help. The saints need help is what I'm saying. It's not the sinners. I'm not worried about the sinners. There are too few of them. It's the saints that need help. And I feel the same way about regulating science. The Sillamar Conference, was a very good example of scientists of taking social responsibility. But it's interesting. The Sillamar Conference is the one example we can really look at very carefully. It was an extraordinary moment. I quite agree with you. And it was a very good example. And scientists in general, I found, in dealing, for example, when we brought the scientific societies to testify before NBAC on cloning, their standard public statement was, just let us do it. We'll know what's right. Just let us do it. And for many of them, I think that's absolutely true. I think they believe that. But I think somehow we're all too frail. Not only scientists, all of us are too frail in positions like that, and they need help. So I agree, I think, with what you said, that scientists should participate. What I think is most seriously needed is very serious conversations between scientists who know a lot about this whole thing and others who are just a little bewildered. And what I mean by a serious conversation is a conversation where both sides agree that maybe they'll change their mind as a result of the conversation. That's what I consider as serious. You go into a conversation where at least you agree in principle that you might change your mind. And more of those conversations are required. And scientists, I think, need to take some leadership. They know the most in this area. Yes?
I'm wondering if you'd comment on something that's become, more imminent. I read the headlines from UCLA the other day about regulation of body parts, whether your commission got into it at all, and it seems to me that's a growing industry, and in that case, the middleman in the situation said, I did everything in accordance with procedure, and the university was well aware. So
Well, I don't know I read about the UCLA situation in the newspaper today and I saw it on TV tonight. I don't know more than what I saw. It sounds like, I don't know what the university was aware of. It sounds certainly like people were breaking the law, number one. Regardless of UCLA's law, they were just breaking the laws of this country if they were selling body parts. And it's a horrible example of something go wrong in a big complex organization where people are just behaving badly. Those situations will occur, but those are, while I very much regret this particular tragedy for the people and their families that were involved, one thing about free society is there are excesses. Freedom comes with excesses, and this is a terrible excess. And we have to think of ways to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Did your commission deal with that?
We did not. We did deal with the issue of selling organs, particularly whether there should be a market, for example, for kidneys or for other transplantable organs. We did not deal with body parts in the sense that they were being dealt with in this case. And it sounds like a horrible situation. I don't know who knew and who didn't, but it sounds horrible from the way described in the newspaper. Yes.
Where is Great Britain on these issues, and what factors led to wherever they are?
Great Britain has a very interesting approach in these issues with respect to human embryonic stem cells. In Great Britain, in order to do research in this area, you need a license. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it in the private sector or public sector, you need a license. And in Great Britain also it's true that fertility clinics need a license to operate, and which is a completely unregulated industry in this country. So Great Britain has eliminated the difference between public and private. And it's on the onus of a researcher or someone who wants to do research on these materials to present a case to the agency that's authorizing this, and they have to agree that the potential benefits are much greater than the cost, so to speak, of doing. And so they have a I don't mean to say, they have a well-organized way of doing it, and they seem to be proceeding in a very sensible way from what I can tell at this distance. And so I think they've found a way to deal with it. It doesn't satisfy everybody, but one of the great advantages is that everybody knows what's going on. Everything is published, everything is public, all the proceedings of what's called the Human Embryology Something Board. And so you always know what's happening. And if you want to protest, you can protest, but I mean, you always know what's happening. I think they've found a very sensible way to do it. Why they got themselves into this in a way which I think is a lot more sensible, I'm not really sure. I think it has something to do, as I mentioned before, with the nature of parliamentary government, where it is much easier for the party in power to take an initiative, and it's very hard to stop it. Whereas here, there's 100 ways that you can stop an initiative by the president or any congressman or head of the Senate and so on. But I think Great Britain is probably the best example in this. Some countries like Germany are very much more restrictive than we are. Other countries are in between. There's a wide variety of experience out there right now. Yes?
It would appear to me that with such dynamic possibilities, Parkinson's, spinal cord injuries, etc., and looking at great social change in America from a groundswell perspective, the end of the Vietnam War, women's rights, civil rights, etc., do you think that there could be a public push, or would be?
I think there will be. I think this is a very unstable position we're in. I don't think the country's going to tolerate it over a long period of time. I think that, for many of the reasons you've suggested, so I don't want to repeat them, but I think this is what I meant when I said it's an unstable policy. It's not going to last, is my view. The pressures are going to be too great. Yes?
Yes. You say that you feel that a big part of the solution is that we must be willing to enter into a discussion with at least the possibility of changing our minds as a result of that discussion. My question is, do you believe this is realistic? Because I myself, the older I get, the more and more I see people getting into discussions with no possibility of changing their minds. Their only desire is to persuade the other side to their own point of view.
Yeah. then that wouldn't qualify what I call serious conversation. But I mean, it's a very important issue you've raised.
But I mean, that's what
There are some-
decision makers are.
I don't think, just to take, I don't think we're going to, some people's minds are not going to be changed. There's large groups of people whose minds are not going to be changed, and we have to focus our efforts with each other, in my view, on those, people who might change their mind. Now, for example, if you just take the major religions, there's an enormous variety of views on this. Even within the various branches of a Protestant church, there's an enormous variety of views. But they're in constant conversation with each other. And I don't think it's impossible, even within the Protestant church, for them to come to some coherent common view over time, because at least those people that I've spoken to have their views now, but they aren't unalterable. And you have to take a very long view on some of these things. The Catholic Church's viewpoint hasn't always been the way it is. As a matter of fact, if you take the long history of the church, it's been the way it is for a very short period of time. And so the Catholic Church will be here a long time, and someday they might have a different perspective. I can't in any way speak for them. It was interesting to me, one of the interesting anecdotes in the cloning hearing was we had a representative from the National Council of Catholic Bishops speak to us, and followed by a representative of Orthodox Judaism talk to us. And it just happened by coincidence, one followed the other. And they both started, not surprisingly, with a quote from the Bible. But what was interesting was that it's a big Bible, but they started with the exact same verse. The verse was, be familiar to many of you, I can't repeat it verbatim, certainly I don't know the Bible well enough, but it was a verse that appears early in Genesis, where it says, God declares himself satisfied with humankind, and he gives them dominion over this and that, and the birds fly and the fishes swim in the sea, and so on and so forth. And both traditions, we were told, trace the moral superiority of human life over other forms of life to that spot in the Bible. However, from that same spot and that same statement, the two traditions just took totally different paths. We were told that the Orthodox Jewish tradition is that this occurs early in the Bible. It's not only that this is really in the form of a commandment. That is, if you can do things and your motivation is right, you should do them. That was the whole purpose. If your motivation is right and you can do them, you should do them. So the whole issue of cloning was that, the question of what your motivation for doing it was. And if your motivation was persuasive, fine, go ahead and do it. And if it's not, then you shouldn't be doing it. The Catholic tradition, as it was related to us, said, no, that's not it. Their whole tradition has spent an awful lot of time deciding what is in fact God's responsibility and what is human responsibility. And some things are reserved for God, as it is in other religions, many other religions as well. And as you all know, in the Catholic tradition, obviously reproduction is one of the things that's reserved for God. Therefore, this is a very simple decision from their perspective. And so I wouldn't have expected in the time frame of my time and the end back to have changed either position. But there are people within those traditions, as we all know, that are more flexible in the traditions themselves. And so I have some hope, but you raise an important issue. Any other questions? Yes?
Isn't it likely over a long period of time, maybe even on a global scale, that economic pressures will always trump these ethical concerns?
Well, economic pressures are very strong. I don't think they always trump, but my own view is in this case it will not be economic pressures, because I think there's not going to be an extraordinary desire for private firms at this time, in my judgment, to invest in this area. The benefits are too far downstream and too speculative. And so this is an ideal kind of investment for governments to make. So I don't think in this particular area, that is human embryonic stem cells, that economic issues are going to dominate, at least not in the near term. And so I think the ethical issues will not be trumped by economic issues. I think the same way in cloning. Cloning is, human reproductive cloning. I know there's all kinds of other cloning. Human reproductive cloning is not a big economic issue. No one's going to have any big economic interests at stake here. So I think on these particular issues, that will not be a concern. Now, whether in the broad scheme of things economic issues always trump, there's certainly a lot of evidence that that could be the case. After all, if you look at the long sweep of history, there's seldom been a period, in my view, which is more materialistic than our own. And so we see increasing commercialization of all parts of our national life, which at one time were not commercialized. And that goes from everything from, from football to religion or something, are busy using the airways for economic purposes. So there's a lot of evidence that position is truer now than ever was. But maybe it's a vain hope, but I don't think it's always will Trump.
Let's have one more. There's somebody in.
Sorry, I couldn't do yes, please, I'm sorry.
What do you think about the current National Bioethics Advisory Committee? Is it diverse? Does it represent, the general public, or does it more represent special interests?
Well, did everyone hear the question?
No.
Do you mind if the question is, what do I think of the current Bioethics Commission? Is it diverse? Does it represent the people? Does it represent special interests, and so on? Well, two things. One, it's now considerably less diverse than it was a month ago, because the two members of the commission who disagreed most with the chairman have just been fired. And so it's less diverse than it was. But is it diverse? No, it's not diverse. Leon Cass, who's the head of it, I have to say, is, on the one hand, I think a very erudite, very thoughtful person, actually. So a long time, thought a lot in this area for a long period of time. He's also, however, a very polemical and very divisive type of figure. And so I don't think it's diverse. But no federal advisory panel is diverse in the sense that you asked. They're all political appointments. They all have some kind of bias, and we just have to work with that as a fact of life. And this council, I think, is somewhat less diverse than most of the others that exist. There have been about 5 or 6 others. And what's most disturbing to me is not the fact that it's not diverse. After all, it's only one voice amongst many. What I do object to is, for example, that they've just published a book, which is typical of the books. Those of you know who have been, anybody here ever do an undergraduate work at the University of Chicago? Well, the University of Chicago, that has a wonderful undergraduate program. They produce all these books, collections of readings. It's a standard kind of thing, a heavy book. Readings over the centuries on this and that issue. Well, the council has produced one, Readings Over the Century, on issues relating to the status of human beings and so on. And while it is an enormously selective group of readings, focusing on only one particular perspective on the issue. And as if that weren't enough, there's an introduction to each reading, which instead of being an introduction is an editorial on the reading. And I think that finally is just a misuse of federal funds. I don't mind that they have their own views on what federal policy should be. They're entitled to them. But to put out something which is in the guise of something that's supposed to be for educational reasons and be so one-sided seemed to me to be going beyond the pale. So, it's a political process. There's a lot of politics involved. Thank you all very much for your attention.